Metal Gear Solid. It started as a military operational stealth game and turned into a battle of mercenaries, co-opted governments, and greater good desires. MGS is both serious and not so serious. This interesting blend on top of a fairly philosophical and nuanced story and writing has made MGS a hit for decades. It's been one of the most transformative video game franchises in history, and was created, or really perfected by, then championed by Hideo Kojima, both in 2D and in 3D. The franchise is a remarkable 30+ years old, and like many old successful franchises, whether they come from Japan like MGS or not, there's always been some talks about what if Metal Gear Solid went online? What would that look like? This is still a question that gets asked quite a bit, whether from fans of the series or those outside of it, but very few are aware that not only did MGS5 have a multiplayer component, it was the third of its iteration, and even, technically speaking, the sixth. Yep, that's right, MG games have been online since 2005. However, despite garnering quite the successful audience over the course of multiple different games and iterations, MGO has always sort of existed outside of the MG zeitgeist and has been treated a bit like a meme. Not just because of lore and perception reasons, but for many reasons that I will detail in this special episode of Death of a Game. Special because not only are we covering Metal Gear Online, we are covering Metal Gear Online 2, and even the 3 PSP spin-off versions. That's right, this video will be the de facto MGO video for us until more come out. As a massive MGS4 fan, this video is a special treat for me, especially being that MGS4 included none other than MGO2. In the Death of a Game series, we dictate the largest contributing factors to a game or company's death or demise by utilizing a timeline full of events and evidence, and uncover clues along the way, all culminating in a final deduction where we put the case to rest. Because in this case we're covering multiple games, we will be making our diagnosis of MGO as a series instead while still covering each individual game. Without further delay, detectives, are you ready to stealth by in a caterpillar-like crawl, hide in boxes, and avoid that pesky alert? Let's get to the case. The story begins off the massive success of MGS3, and when I say massive success, I'm not understating such. MGS3 still to this day, the second 3D MGS is still considered one of the greatest games of all time. Coming about a year or two after MGS3, Snake Eater was a follow-up expansive re-release dubbed Subsistence. Subsistence would include some of the extras from the PAL version of MGS3, in addition to a new 3D camera, as well as featuring 3 discs, one being mostly about supplemental content, and the last disc being a multiplayer game component dubbed MGO by none other than Kojima himself. MGO or MGO1 was a fully functional multiplayer game that consisted of a variety of modes, with up to 8 players. Each of these players would play as a generic soldier, which was a contrast to the single player, and would participate in modes such as Capture the Flag, Deathmatch, and more that were unique to the series. Where MGO is quite unique, or at least another unique aspect of it, besides having stealth elements in a multiplayer shooter, which was already incredibly unique for the time, is that top performing players got the ability to play as one of the heroes of the game. Think something like Battlefront. These characters like Snake or Major Rykov would have unique abilities. Besides this uniqueness, MGO would also boast a variety of ways to play the game. While the first iteration would not have a skill system so everyone was actually equal to each other, there was more of a focus on sneaking in general. Issues of MGO1 were due to there being limited hiding options, even if stealth was included, how powerful headshot spam was, and finally, the rampant spawn camping and hacking in the game, though mainly in the form of lag switching. All of the original maps would be quite memorable, as they would then be featured in the subsequent versions of the game as well. The problem with MGO wasn't just the problems of the game though, it was coming from a market who is notorious for sunsetting their online games early. The Japanese market, see my Dragon's Dogma video, and a developer who didn't have much multiplayer experience in general. This would both lead to honest, pioneer-like mistakes, sure, but also translate into the game being shut down so early, it never even got a proper footing, or a chance to expand or evolve on what the game was. Within just 1 year, Konami would shut down MGO1 despite the game's success and core audience. Now this is even worse than Japan in modern times, who will sunset online games after a mere 4 or 5 years. But there's a reason that MGO1 isn't well remembered. You had to have been there for the year that it was around. And MGO1 is a sad story within the MGO microcosm of the story because it never got a chance to be expanded, and they seemingly abandoned its core tenets for the subsequent games as well. This is very likely why much later on the game would be revived by the community efforts. It was, simply put, unique, both for the time and in the series of MGO itself. Coming as a bit of a surprise to many, well, at least myself included, MGO would actually have a portable component that would launch December 5th, 2006, dubbed Metal Gear Solid Portable Ops for the PSP, or MPO, which actually stood for Metal Gear People Online, according to Kojima himself. While the name might sound a little bit silly, it's because the game is actually squad-based, hence the word ops. While technically speaking MPO was separate from the MGO series, it mimicked many of the same mechanics, with some expansions brought in the form of single-player synergy. Effectively, MPO had MGO1 inside of it, with some cool and unique additions. For example, in the single player, you could meet and recruit characters that you could then play as or encounter in the multiplayer online component. The catch was that these characters could actually permanently die in your multiplayer game unless you saved them before the game ended, bringing synergy to the single player and multiplayer for the first time in the series. And honestly, it's still to this day an incredibly unique and in some ways risky mechanic. But this is exactly what you expect from spin-off titles of sorts and why I love the handhelds and why I love handheld games so much. MGO2 would host its first exclusive beta test in Japan August 2007, and MGO2 would be bundled with the next MGS in the series, the fourth installment, Guns of the Patriot. MPO would come out with an expansion of sorts, dubbed MPO Plus, that would emphasize a lot more the online play the previous game featured. This game introduced a rookie system as well, which was novel and allowed new players to receive less damage and make it easier for them to then compete online. Some of the modes dubbed with pluses were featured in the new version of the game, while it still featured the previous game modes and features. MPO Plus also added 4 unique characters that players could recruit, like Old Snake, Raiden, Ray Campbell from the Portable Ops 1 version, and Johnny from MGS3. MPO Plus had a surprising amount of customization too, featuring up to 8 new unit types from previous MG games. MGO Plus was successful, still managing to sell over 1 million copies despite being a spin-off title. Metal Gear Online 2 would come to the West for the first time April 2008. MGO2 would launch bundled with the 4th iteration of the MGS series, Guns of the Patriot, June 12, 2008. This would mark the second and last time that MGO would launch subsequently with the game that it was bundled with, and not at a later time. We won't spend too much time on MGS4, which is my favorite iteration in the series I should add, and one that yet again reached universal acclaim. MGS4 is like a movie. Literally. You can go watch it on YouTube. But in this video, we're going to focus on the multiplayer component of that very successful game. MGO2 would mimic many of the previous aspects of MGO, including game modes, maps, and even the player amount. Where MGO2 would differ the most would be the new engine, as common with new iterations in the series, on top of having way more common multiplayer features, though many of which would have to be added later. MGO2, besides some new modes as well, would also feature non-lethal weapons such as stun knives and grenades, and feature a lot more CQC, or close quarters combat, which the series was famous for. Now, there are some negatives of the game, and sadly many of these are recurring issues and points of contention for some, which is why the audience was rather niche, such as how the game only had a fraction of the content of MGO1 until it was later expanded, and those expansions you had to purchase, and the new characters that got added were mode exclusive, lacking great variety by comparison to MGO1. Or how powerful headshots were, and due to how the auto-aim system functioned, this made the more skilled player just that much more skilled. And to be fair, this is an issue that GTA suffers from too, but usually they get around it by having different lobbies for auto-aim and for non-auto-aim. This might sound normal for shooters, but not really for the MGS series. Think about it. It barely had any actual shooting in it, and the concept of headshots don't really matter when you're a trained CQC stealth specialist, right? Or at least it's not the focus of the game. It's not the focal point. I mean, not even Sam Fisher is sniping people, right? So imagine you're playing a stealth game and you just get capped instantly. It doesn't translate to the most fun or counterable gameplay in MGO in general. The final 2 issues, the largest issues that MGO2 suffered from, arguably, was a poor community and degenerate or glitchy gameplay. Things like box popping, knife stab canceling, how to use auto-aim properly, which was a feat in itself, and the running grenade throw. Sure, many of these would elevate the skill level, but they would also alienate the majority of the players who weren't kosher with the gameplay glitches that they were now forced to learn, especially when the developers didn't really care, as they would always abandon each MGO iteration for the next. Personal aside though, and not a very controversial one, but I think that MGO2, ironically, despite being kind of the most positively received one, has the worst combat, because the combat in MGS4 wasn't that great either. Online PvP looks like auto-aim slide fest with items thrown in at random times. Made worse by the fact that the rookie system was missing in MGO2, and the community would then essentially cannibalize any players who couldn't conform to the gameplay styles or desire to maximize their stats. Yeah, you heard that right. KDA maximizing and stackers were huge in MGO, and if people were about to lose their precious KDA, they would either leave the game or lag switch so they could still win. They cared little about gameplay experiences for some, as they would spawn camp and even headshot people as soon as they would spawn. I think in a sense, because the MGO community wasn't just really well regulated, and treated like a community of its own, separate from the MGS crowd, it became quite counterculture, and had that old school internet vibe to it. But sometimes when you're not in the in crowd, that translates to a subpar experience, especially for new players who aren't knowledgeable or bought into the new crowd and don't really have a chance to actually learn the game because they're just getting spanked by the same elite players. But that being said, MGO2 is the most popular MGO by far, partly due to the timing in which it came out, and the other part due to Konami actually taking the time to continue to work on the game and evolve it with updates and expansions. So by the end of things, MGO2 was the most expanded MGO. For example, the Gene expansion was released pretty much right at launch and allowed you to play in 2 new maps, a new gameplay mode, Survival, which would become a community classic and favorite, a new reward system, and 2 new characters. The issue being that this was a $12 to $15 expansion, depending on if you got the extra $3 for the extra charge slot. That barely brought MGO2 to where MGO was content-wise though. This is common in the Death of Game series, and rarely if ever has good or positive results, where a new title releases but takes a major paid update or expansion to actually become in alignment to a base level of where the previous game was or where their competitors are. Random lore bit, but genes are actually a big thing in MGS, so it might sound strange, but it's kind of a core concept of the series. It's very much about passing your genes, hence all the different snakes, and yeah, you heard that right. Konami would follow this up with yet another expansion, this time dubbed the Meme expansion. And no, I'm not kidding. This expansion would cost $7 and add 3 new maps, a stealth deathmatch game mode, which is a personal favorite of mine, and some new items. It also would add things like the clan and emblem systems. Again though, you're paying $7 for your game to have a clan system and 1 game mode and some new maps, which it probably should have already launched with. It's not really the best value proposition. Worse, you actually needed the previous expansion Gene to play the Meme expansion, meaning you had to drop $20 on top of the box price of MGS4. For a game mode treated like a side affair, online or not, this just didn't make the most sense to me. It very likely separated their player base even more, harming how much player activity would happen online. Scene, the final expansion, would add 3 new maps, new items, and 2 new chars, Raiden and Vamp. This expansion would also introduce the tournament mode into the game, which in my opinion is probably one of the most unique aspects of the game. I know, more unique things. This game is so damn unique. Tournaments would consist of a variety of modes and be daily or weekly affairs where players would compete for the best scores and points to unlock the best things and for bragging rights. Unfortunately though, these tournaments and much of the matchmaking in MGO2 is plagued by, and throughout its short official life, with DDoS attacks and even nerds lag switching so they could keep their precious points. This could result in winning a match outright even. While at first, Konami was able to hide player IPs to prevent this, the hackers started targeting the official servers, which were based on peer-to-peer and not dedicated. Even up until MGO was shut down, these attacks would persist, showing that Konami either designed a flawed online system or just didn't have the chops to know how to fix it after the fact. A year after the final expansion of MGO2, and yet another PSP title would come out, featuring some unique gameplay aspects and multiplayer, dubbed Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker. In Peace Walker's multiplayer, you could play with up to 6 players in some of the classic modes, or co-op missions, or even co-op boss battles. I think Peace Walker is a hidden gem. Not only is it a co-op MGS, it was playable online. The co-op was also positively remembered. I mean, just look at how many playthroughs exist on YouTube of it. Sure, the multiplayer was limited in terms of items and maps and weapons and scope, as per usual for the PSP. You can actually still play Peace Walker online too, utilizing the PSN or Xbox Live networks with the HD collection recently released. This is cool, because the collection didn't actually include MGO, or a playable version of it. So it's like Konami threw us a little bit of a bone there. MGO2 and the portable ops servers would be shut down a mere 4 years after the launch of the game, and 3 years after the last expansion. Now, this might seem very strange to, just about anybody except for Japanese developers, and maybe some in their market, but MGO2 being shut down, as sad as it was, and unexpected to some fans, this was actually par for the course for Konami, who shut down the first game after only a year. But this is also normal for the Japanese market, who seems to see little value in maintaining online games after they have moved on from them. This might seem strange, with how Korea basically invented maintenance mode as a concept in development, but these markets are completely different in more ways than one. Largest being that Japan is a console market largely, and console online games have a less and shorter expectation for their lifecycle, which shouldn't be the case, and it's not good, but partly comes from the fact that consoles are usually separate platforms, while the PC is the PC. So if a new console comes out, it's time to move on to the next one kind of idea. Now maybe time will change how Japan feels about this, and it does seem to be trending towards more of a PC market over time, but as it stands, it's still slow moving towards that change. I mean, they only recently, just a few years ago, shut down Dragon's Dogma Online despite its success, or how Yoshi P's first online game, Dragon Quest X or X, shut down earlier this year. I dislike Japan in terms of how they handle video game preservation and respecting their previous online titles, but at the very least they aren't entirely antagonistic about it, allowing many private servers of their most popular online Japanese games to exist. MGO3 would be announced following the shutdown, which was Konami's way of basically saying, hey, don't be mad guys, but think about it. How many more customers are you going to convince and keep convincing when they and the old customers are no longer interested in spending money on a multiplayer variant that gets abandoned for the next one anyway? And this is where MGO as a franchise starts to become more relegated to kind of like a side mode or the background, even more than before. I mean, this was a franchise that had a standalone release in Japan and saw so much success that it had multiple iterations that got resurrected by fans. Like in 2014 when the community behind Save MGO saved MGO1 and revived it to still be playable today. Sure, maybe you could argue that we should treat MGO like Battlefield or a COD entry that just comes out every new year and then refreshes. The issue being is that MGO's unique gameplay and the space between these releases is far more significant. On top of this, MGO is shutting their servers down faster than multiplayer shooters shut down, like even COD. Like yeah, you heard that right. The steel man for MGO taking this approach is that they get to flex their new muscles on a new engine with new gameplay every 5 years or so. But this entire section really is dedicated to showcase how tired of Konami most MGO and really online gaming fans had grown, and how they do very little to keep their MGO fans' trust for a long period. This does the franchise harm and keeps players from jumping in again, and does little to keep MGO from being anything more than just a side mode. Oh, and Konami would enlist in the help of their newly minted LA studio, Kojima Productions, to handle development, with the Japanese branch handling the updates following the launch. This would split the teams working on the two games. MGS5 would have its own team, and MGO3 would have its own team. The issue being, and we're jumping ahead a little bit, while this would work out for MGS5, it wouldn't work out well for MGO3. As MGO3, despite having some of the best gameplay, is easily the most forgotten or ignored MGO title. Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain would launch September 1st, 2015 on nearly all platforms, and MGS5 would go on again, much like its predecessors, to be universally acclaimed, and even more impressively, is the best-selling MGS since the original. It would also be the last Kojima-designed MGS as far as I understand, as he would depart the company the same year. MGO, which would typically launch bundled with the MGS that it would launch with, wouldn't do so with MGS5, as Konami would actually delay the project, both on PC and on consoles. Now this might sound strange as it was supposed to be bundled together, but actually because MGO3 was helmed by a different studio and separate from MGS5, it effectively was its own standalone game in many ways. Well, at least technically. This is why its delay makes a bit more sense, and yet was still worrying to see, when it never had happened previously. Some believe the separate nature of the games would make MGO3 the best in the series, but unfortunately, that wouldn't match reality. Where there's smoke, there's fire, and the delay wasn't seemingly based on nothing. In fact, Konami would straight up tell the studio behind MGO3, Konami LA altogether, that they were on ice. Now, I can only imagine this was because the studio was seen as a failure and no longer needed in Konami's POV post-release, which would be wrong, obviously. But still, shuttering the company all the way and shuttering it before launch was worrying. And many of these worries were later substantiated. But let's dive into the short story of Kojima Productions LA, which was actually a secondary studio for Kojima's own Kojima Productions company, which he would later activate post-Konami. Konami would team up with Kojima Productions LA with the idea of utilizing Western multiplayer shooter experiences to buff their MGO series. They would take over development on the project sometime in 2013 and would then swell to a team of around 50 developers. MGO3 would launch on consoles October 6, 2015, before launching on PC later, and reviews of it were largely lukewarm, which was not the kind of reception the Kojima LA team needed, with so much riding on them. In The Guardian's review of MGO3, and one of the only reviews, since it was oftentimes bundled into the game in terms of reviews, since not many people went back and reviewed it after the game came out, they would call it the most narrowest attempt at crossing over to online gaming in the series yet. The Guardian was extra harsh on the multiplayer, as it, in their opinion, did very little to mimic or outshine the single-player gameplay. While some might feel it's unfair to compare the two, you have to acknowledge that most MGS fans aren't playing MGS first for multiplayer, so their expectations are always going to come from that direction, especially when MGO3 launched after MGS5. Worse, MGO3 only had 3 game modes: Bounty Hunter, Cloak and Dagger, often dubbed the best mode since it's actually about stealth, and then the final mode, Comms Control, aka King of the Hill. With 3 classes, with unique abilities and different progression paths, unfortunately playing a lot like each other, and only 5 maps being offered, which were largely pulled from the single player, which is why they feel way too massive, and 4 of which are liked and 1 of which is hated, due to it being very easy to spawn camp. Immediately upon console launch, lobbies were filled with the same 15 players, playing the same few maps and modes, and these players, being veterans, would just smash everybody else, with no competitive ranking or matchmaking especially. The only hope for MGO3 getting more support, with its parent company dead, and the expectations of it not matching reality, Konami thought that MGO could be a COD or Battlefield level title. Now, let that marinate for a second. And as soon as that didn't happen, before even fully launching, they pulled the plug. And this would likely go on a long list of bizarre Konami decisions post-Kojima. MGO3 would launch on PC and get a bump in its overall population, but the issue being that the games were not cross-play enabled. So the audiences were still separate. Once again, we have an instance in the series where a powerful game publisher wants their title to be majorly competitive, but can't even manage to give it industry standard mechanics or features. But at least it got a PC release, which the previous 2 versions didn't. But going back to the standard mechanics and features, in the competitive world of online shooters, having these is a must. The first thing people are going to ask about is many of these features, because they're used to them, they're accustomed to them. MGO3 was a prime example of this. It missed things like text chat. MGO3, in its attempt to be like COD, with regenerating health, which was a new addition to the series, quick diving and sprinting, and a class system, had created a game that not even its core audience liked that much, and the COD and Battlefield players probably didn't even know existed, because COD is nothing like MGO or MGO3, and there's probably not very much crossover. Now, to add some of my personal sense here, one of my favorite online shooter/game types is the Splinter Cell Merc vs. Spy series, my personal favorite being Double Agent. In this series, you take on a role as a spy who must obtain important information while avoiding the mercenaries that are tasked with tracking you down. It's a series about subterfuge, with spies having nearly no ability to fight without first utilizing stealth and investigation, 2 of my favorite things as a detective. This series would continue on from multiple games and still sees some play on player-hosted servers today. Now, I bring it up because I like it, but also to contrast it to something like MGO. And you can clearly see that MGO was changing its DNA with each subsequent release of the game. With the third, it fully was trying to change its DNA to something more like a shooter, with stealth elements added on. But even in all 3 versions of MGO, they can sadly, depending on the game mode, just be beaten by running and gunning. Contrast this with mercs and spies, and it can't be won that way, because spies don't even have guns, and because you take turns having different roles and tasks. By giving you the ability to play as Snake, both literally and figuratively, there came far more expectations with such, single-player ones. Meanwhile, the experience in single-player and multiplayer in Splinter Cell was vastly different, sure, but MGO could have fixed that with more of a focus on the game modes that weren't so symmetrical, which they had in MGO2, but alas, it was clear that that was not the direction that they wanted to go in, for whatever reason. So really, the expectations placed on MGO from its own parent company Konami to be some next big online hit shooter, and the expectations of MGS fans of it, well, being a better gaming experience, has made MGO, especially the 3rd iteration, pretty lackluster. MGO would receive a few balance updates, and then a DLC release. March 15th, 2016. Cloaked in Silence would cost only $4 and add 3 new maps, a new multiplayer char, Quiet, who is a sniper, and then increase the verticality with those said new maps. Konami Japan would then follow this update up with another April 7th, 2016, which would add the survival mode back from MGO2. Now, you can read in the comments on this expansion across multiple platforms and on different forums that the new maps and expansions are cool, but they just further split the player base. And many of the comments also echoing that nobody's even playing the game anymore, especially after they bought the expansion. But MGS nor Konami would give up on multiplayer yet, with the launch of Metal Gear Survive in 2018, a bizarre zombie survival spin-off that would predictably flop, only selling 31,359 copies the first week. While this might seem in a weird way like a positive thing, like Konami wasn't giving up on multiplayer yet, but if anything it was worrying because this was their attempt at going full copycat with their IP, and utterly failing. And that actually might dissuade future attempts. MGO2 would be finally resurrected 2021 by the same team behind the first game's revival. Huzzah for communities and players doing more for video game preservation than those who built the games in the first place. Metal Gear Solid 3 would have a remake announced in May of 2023, and I mention this as a particular timeline event because MGS3 of course led to the eventual creation of the first MGO. The key difference being, and I kind of skated over this, was that Kojima himself was the biggest supporter of MGO. With his presence gone, you saw what happened with Kojima LA Studios' attempt at the franchise. I guess without sounding too doom and gloom, I'm trying to say that just because MGS3 is getting a remake doesn't mean that they're gonna remake MGO. But luckily, although MGO3 is still playable, although it's quite hard to find games with populated lobbies, MGO2 is easily more popular depending on the time, especially with the reintroduction of survival mode in June of 2023. Now to be fair, one issue that MGO1 and MGO2 even on the private server still suffers from is that it's still pretty much all of the same elite players smashing on everybody else, which always seemed to be an issue that the game just couldn't kick. So although you can still access MGO1 and 2 in the form of a community-supported server, their support, officially, was cancelled by Konami many moons ago. With MGO3 still kicking, it might seem like there's a bit of light, but MGO3 has already had its Xbox 360 and PS4 multiplayer servers shut down, leading to a precedent all too familiar for MGO fans. Konami, yet again, shutting down another MGO too soon without enough care or love given to it. With that music playing in the background, and 7 to 8 of the titles featured in the overarching MGO branch having been officially shut down already, with only one remaining, that means that it's time for the final deduction, detectives. We have gathered more than enough clues, and it's time now to list the largest contributing factors to both the death of MGO and the faltering of it as an overall series. Well, in case you didn't pick up on them on your own, during the clue segments throughout the timeline, why did MGO die? The games in the series are rather disconnected from the overall series. Each MGO was abandoned quite quickly. The single-player expectations were just heavy, confusing overall direction, and never really got serious post-support post-MGO2. Konami had little or not so good experience with multiplayer titles. Earlier titles outshined the later ones due to the content and care given. MGO throughout its lifetime was always plagued with server issues. It had quite the toxic community unfriendly to new or noob players. But MGO, there really isn't anything like it. That's why I cringed when I saw the attempts at Konami trying to make the most recent entry indeed that, something that was like other games. No, MGO was special. It had plenty of the goofy humor that the series was famous for, on top of really funny gameplay and game design, where the goofiest of things could happen when people weren't just turbo nerd headshotting each other to death. MGO wasn't just special because it was Metal Gear Solid, it was almost special in spite of that. Yeah. In many ways, it lived in the shadow of its single player and the series, and that kind of held back MGO, or at least it put it to a crazy standard that it could never match up to. MGO though was special and zany and different. It was unique in itself, and it was doing gameplay online in the early 2000s that nobody else was, not even my favorite Spies vs. Merc Splinter Cell series. No online multiplayer shooter has ever committed to being so unique and goofy, warts and all, than MGO. And yet, at the same time, it felt like a series never quite destined for the mainstream because of that. And sometimes that's perfectly fine, detectives. Thanks for watching.
Alright, let's do this.
Alright, Sal. Do I look at you or the camera?